They said he was just an old man with a shovel, that he didn't belong in the future, that his ways were buried with the past. But when the food ran out, when the fields dried up, and when all the experts had no answers, they came back to the man who never stopped listening to the land. This is the powerful true-to-life story of Elijah Walker, an elderly black farmer in Alabama who went from being mocked by his town to saving the entire region with ancestral farming wisdom the world had forgotten. A story of resilience, roots, and redemption. If you're drawn to stories that stir the soul and speak to the quiet strength of forgotten wisdom, this one's for you. Before we begin, hit that like button to support stories that deserve to be heard. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives rooted in history, humanity, and hope. And as you listen, tell us in the comments, what does the land mean to you? Now, let's begin the story of how the earth remembered his name. In a quiet corner of Alabama, an old black farmer named Elijah Walker spends his days digging soil and tending to land others have long abandoned. Mocked by his town and overlooked by the modern world, he holds close the ancestral farming methods passed down through generations, methods dismissed as outdated and irrelevant. But when a devastating food crisis strikes the region, and conventional systems collapse, all eyes turn to the very man they once ridiculed. What unfolds is a journey of quiet resistance, sacred remembrance, and the power of listening to the earth. As Elijah's forgotten wisdom begins to nourish not only the land but the people, his humble legacy grows into a global movement, proving that in the hands of the patient, the soil remembers, heals, and ultimately honors those who serve it with love. This is the story of one man who dug when others paved over. The story of the earth that remembered his name. Disclaimer: the story presented in this video is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events is purely coincidental. This narrative was created for the purpose of delivering moral lessons, motivation, inspiration, and educational value. It is not based on real-life individuals or historical events. Viewer discretion is advised for those seeking factual accounts. The Alabama sun was just beginning to stretch its fingers over the horizon when Elijah Walker stepped out onto his porch. The morning air still held the cool breath of night, but the heat would come soon enough. As always, Elijah's boots were already muddy. His wide-brimmed hat cast a long shadow over his face, and in his hand was the same rusted hoe he had used for more years than most folks in the village had been alive. His land sat on the edge of Sable Ridge, where the roads thinned and the woods leaned in close. It was a modest spread, just enough to be called a farm, but it breathed with the history of 6 generations. To anyone else it looked tired, but to Elijah it was still alive. It whispered to him in the wind, hummed in the soil beneath his boots, and sighed when the rains came just right. Every morning he worked in silence. No tractors, no drones, no apps tracking his crops. Just the rhythm of the earth and the memory of his grandfather's voice guiding his hands. By midday the townsfolk would start passing by. They always did. "Still out here digging like it's 1865, huh, Eli?" A voice called from the road. It was Marcus Bell, owner of Bell Harvest Company, a large farm operation that boasted shiny green equipment and a fleet of workers. His truck rumbled past, the window rolled down just long enough to let the insult out. Elijah didn't flinch. He never did. He kept digging. Old Dirt Hands, the kids had nicknamed him years ago. A joke that caught on so well even grown folks said it now without thinking twice. They laughed at his old methods, planting by moon phases, using animal manure, making compost by hand, walking his land barefoot at dawn to feel the tension in the soil, as he called it. He became a relic, a curiosity. Some even suggested the town should buy up his land for development, turn it into something useful. Elijah never responded. He'd just nod politely, tip his hat, and return to his soil. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that the earth had been speaking to Elijah for decades. His grandfather, Joseph Walker, had taught him to listen when he was a boy, taught him that farming wasn't just about growing crops. It was about knowing when the land was ready to give and when it needed to rest. About respect. Elijah, his grandfather once said, standing in a field of sweet potatoes under the setting sun, "This land don't belong to us. We belong to it. And if you treat it like family, it'll feed you like one." Those words stayed with Elijah like roots under soil. Strong. Inside the village, things were different. More efficient, more advanced, they claimed. There were chemical sprays, automated irrigation systems, yield forecasts, and soil sensors. Farms looked more like factories now. And yet, year after year, Elijah's little plots stayed green, quietly productive. Nobody paid attention. Until the rain started to forget its way to Sable Ridge. It began as a dry spring. Folks didn't panic at first. Weather was unpredictable, they said. The state would bring relief, they promised. The clouds would return. But they didn't. By summer, the creek near the Bell farm ran dry. Crops began to wilt in the fields. The once vibrant farmland turned pale, thirsty. Panic started showing up in the eyes of men who once laughed the loudest. Still, Elijah dug. He worked his rows with calm precision, mulching his soil with layers of decomposed leaves and straw, locking in the moisture. He rotated his crops with a pattern learned from generations long gone. He planted cover crops during off-seasons. He whispered to his plants. No one understood why his fields were still green. Some started to notice. On a scorching Thursday afternoon, young Ava Cartwright, daughter of the mayor, wandered past Elijah's fence line with a notebook in hand. "Why do your tomatoes look like that?" she asked, squinting at the lush plants. Elijah looked up, wiped his brow, and offered her one. "Because they still remember where they come from." She blinked, confused, but took the tomato and bit in. The taste hit her like memory, sweet, rich, full. That night she told her father. Her father told the town council. But most still shrugged it off. Luck, they said. A fluke. A freak patch of fertile soil. Elijah didn't argue. He just went back to his field. The mocking didn't stop overnight, but something shifted. The laughs came softer now. And some stopped entirely. A few brave souls began to slow their cars as they passed his land. Eyes scanning his rows. Watching. And still Elijah dug. Because the earth was speaking louder now. And it was getting hungry. It was the 4th week of August, and the ground in Sable Ridge had turned to cracked porcelain. Grass withered at the roots, and the once bustling weekly farmers market in the town square looked like a skeleton of its former self. Tables sat bare, vendors leaning on elbows with empty baskets and hollow smiles. The fountains were dry. The trees stood still. Conversations around town grew sharper, shorter. People stopped greeting each other with pleasantries and started whispering about government shipments and ration schedules. Gas stations began limiting water bottle purchases. Grocery stores installed locks on their bulk bins. The hum of confidence that once filled the village was replaced with the silence of waiting and worrying. The mayor, Jonathan Cartwright, who once prided himself on modernization and growth, now sat red-faced at town meetings, fielding questions he could no longer answer. "Where's the backup irrigation you promised? You said the soil sensors would prevent this. What about the emergency fund? What are we supposed to eat?" His answers came in sighs and half-statements. Every expert the state sent in blamed the drought on an unusual weather pattern, a once-in-a-century event. But to Elijah Walker, it wasn't unusual. It was overdue. The land had been warning them. For years he had seen the patterns shifting. The rain becoming erratic. The seasons arriving out of rhythm. He had warned a few folks quietly. Suggested rotating fields more often. Told the new farmers not to overwork the land. He was met with polite nods and quiet dismissal. Now they were listening, but it might already be too late. That week, Elijah was tending his rows of beans when he heard tires crunching the dirt road that ran along his fence. He looked up and saw a white pickup truck pull over. It was the mayor himself. He stepped out, sweat staining his collar, and approached with cautious humility. "Elijah," he began, "I won't waste your time." "You already did," Elijah said, not unkindly, just truthful. Cartwright lowered his eyes. "I need help. The town." "I know." The two men stood in silence for a long moment. Behind them, cicadas buzzed in the dry air. "What do you need?" Elijah finally asked, setting down his hoe. Cartwright hesitated, as if the words were still hard to form. "We need to learn what you know." It was a strange thing to hear from the man who once offered Elijah money to sell his land for a community tech park. But Elijah didn't gloat. He simply nodded once and said, "Bring people tomorrow. I'll show you how to listen." The next morning, a small crowd gathered outside his fence, skeptical at first, arms crossed and faces tight. Elijah walked out to meet them, his voice calm, deliberate. "I ain't got magic," he said. "What I have was passed down like old songs. This land has a language and y'all been yelling over it." He knelt down and scooped up a handful of soil. "It tells you when it's tired, when it needs cover, when it wants to be left alone. It's not a machine. You can't squeeze it dry and expect it to love you." They watched as he walked them through his composting piles, rich and dark like chocolate. He showed them how he kept his soil shaded with straw mulch, how he used native plants to invite pollinators, how he grew beans beside corn, letting one support the other. A few tried to argue, but the data shows. Elijah silenced them with a glance. Not harsh. Just tired. Your data's written on paper. Mine's written in roots. They kept coming. More people day after day. Young farmers with smartphones in their pockets and sweat on their brows. Mothers with empty grocery bags and hungry eyes. Teachers, pastors, even teenagers, notebooks in hand, writing everything down like scripture. They helped him harvest. Helped him sow fall crops. Helped him dig swales in the land to trap the precious little rain that still fell. Ava Cartwright became his shadow. She asked questions non-stop, filled a whole journal with his answers. Elijah saw her grandfather's curiosity in her. He began calling her Little Soil. And still the drought held on. But in Elijah's fields, food grew. Squash, beans, okra, tomatoes heavy as dreams. Enough for a dozen families at first. Then 20, then 30. They cooked together under tents. Shared meals in the open. A community once defined by distance began stitching itself back together, row by row. One evening, as the sun draped itself across the fields, Elijah stood beside Ava watching volunteers gather the latest harvest. "You hear that?" he asked her. She paused, listening. "Hear what?" "The silence between the raindrops," he said. "The land's waiting, just like us." She didn't fully understand. Not yet. But she nodded. Because in that silence, something had changed. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about remembering. And the earth had not forgotten Elijah Walker. Sable Ridge awoke to a sky the color of old iron. The heat had not lessened, but something had shifted in the air. There was a weight to it, as if the wind had grown tired of pretending all was well. Dogs paced restlessly on porches. Birds flew low and erratic. Even the trees stood differently, as if bracing themselves. Elijah stood barefoot in the center of his field, his toes pressing into the soil. His eyes were closed. He wasn't praying, not in the way most people did, but he was listening. To the stillness. To the hum underneath the dirt. To the conversation between seed and sky. Then it happened. One raindrop. Then two. Then a gentle, scattered rhythm that grew into applause from the clouds. The people of Sable Ridge ran outside as if they had seen a ghost. Children shouted with joy, arms wide to catch the droplets. Elders wept openly. It had been over 2 months since the last rain. But this wasn't just moisture falling from the sky. This was a sign. And every eye turned toward Elijah's land, as though it had conjured the miracle. Later that evening, while the soil drank deeply and the air turned soft and clean again, the mayor arrived at Elijah's porch with company. 2 men in beige suits stood behind him, official-looking types with small notebooks and big eyes. "Elijah," the mayor said, "these gentlemen are from the Agricultural Sustainability Bureau. They read the report Ava submitted last week." The men nodded with reverence. "Mr. Walker," one began, "we're here because what you're doing out here is working. And not just working, it's outperforming every modern model we've tested in similar drought conditions." "I ain't doing nothing special," Elijah replied. "I'm just letting the land remember itself." The taller man stepped forward. "We'd like to document your techniques if you'll allow it. Share them with other farming communities in affected areas. Possibly build a model around your practices." Elijah looked down at his hands, calloused and lined with time. "You want me to teach what nobody wanted to learn when I was trying to give it away for free?" The question lingered in the air, sharp as a scythe. The mayor spoke gently. "I was wrong, Elijah. We all were. And if we're going to make things right, we need your help." Elijah studied them. The officials. The mayor. Ava, standing nearby with dirt on her knees and hope in her notebook. Then he looked past them to the volunteers still in his fields, harvesting with care and laughter. "You want to learn?" he said at last. "Then you work beside me. Not behind some glass. Not from a podium. You get your hands in this dirt and let the earth judge you." They agreed. The next day the suits rolled up their sleeves. Others came too. Researchers from the university, local reporters, farmers from neighboring counties. Cameras showed up and still Elijah made them dig. He taught them how to read the soil by scent, how to feel moisture below the surface without a tool, how to plant in a rhythm that followed not the calendar but the land itself. Word spread. Fast. An article in a regional paper called him the Soil Whisperer. A popular podcast titled their episode, "The Old Man Who Grew Miracles." And yet Elijah remained unchanged. He still rose before dawn. Still walked barefoot in the fields. Still tended his compost like it was a newborn. Then came the invitation. One morning, Ava handed him a letter, trembling in her hand. "From the Global Agricultural Initiative," she said. "They're hosting a summit in Geneva. They want you to speak." Elijah took the envelope, turned it in his hands like it might vanish. He didn't open it right away, just stared off toward his fields. "I never been on a plane," he muttered. "Then it's about time," Ava said. He smiled, a slow, surprised smile that seemed to rise from somewhere deep in his chest. Later, after the letter was read and the decision was made, he stood on his porch while the sun dipped low. He looked out over his land, now teeming with life and purpose, and exhaled. The wind moved again. Different this time. Honest. The international terminal at Birmingham Shuttlesworth Airport was a place Elijah Walker never imagined himself. The glass walls stretched high and wide, and the floor gleamed like water under electric lights. His boots clunked softly with each step, and his hands, calloused and dark, clutched the strap of an old leather satchel Ava had given him the night before. "You'll need this," she had said, stuffing it with a clean shirt, a worn notebook, and a small photo of the farm. When Elijah boarded the plane, the hum of the engines reminded him of cicadas in the trees after a long rain. As the land of Alabama fell away beneath the clouds, he held tight to the image of his fields, the beans curling up their poles, the squash leaves wide like open hands, the rich brown soil breathing under the sun. Geneva welcomed him with cool air and tall buildings that curved like glass hills. The summit was held inside a sprawling hall filled with people from every corner of the world. Flags lined the walls. Screens projected graphs and models. Men and women walked briskly in suits, holding tablets and coffee cups, speaking in clipped, urgent tones. Elijah stood among them in his faded flannel and worn boots. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but when he did, silence followed. On the third day they gave him the podium. The room was filled. Ministers of agriculture, professors from prestigious universities, climate scientists, even members of the press. Lights aimed at his face. Cameras blinked like curious eyes. He stepped forward and placed his notebook on the stand. The microphone was too high. He ignored it. "I ain't got slides," he said, his voice low and firm. "Ain't got no laser pointers. No data sets." There was a stir in the crowd. A few shifted in their seats. "What I got," Elijah continued, "is dirt under my nails and food on the tables of people who didn't have none. What I got is a piece of land in Alabama that still breathes because my granddaddy taught me how to listen to it." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Y'all come here talking about sustainability like it's a new thing. But where I come from, we've been practicing it since before we had the word for it. We didn't have a choice. We saved seeds in jars. We rotated crops, because we couldn't afford to poison the ground. We fed our compost like it was kin. And when the rain didn't come, we found ways to catch what little did." More eyes were on him now. Phones lowered. Notebooks paused. "I seen y'all farms from your pictures. Machines taller than barns, fields sprayed till they shine like plastic. You call it progress. I call it forgetting. You forgot what your grandmothers knew. You forgot that the land ain't a factory. It's a memory." There was a stillness in the room now that no technology could create. Just the weight of truth. "I ain't here to impress nobody. I'm here, 'cause people are starving. Not just for food but for wisdom. For patience. For the old ways that still work. You don't need to reinvent the earth. You need to remember it." He stepped back. No applause followed. Not yet. Just breath. Held. Released. Then slowly, like ripples on still water, the room began to rise to its feet. First one row. Then two. Then the entire hall. The next day, his face appeared in newspapers with headlines like "The Farmer Who Brought the Earth to Geneva" and "Wisdom in Boots." Elijah Walker's message echoes across the globe. Interviews poured in. Universities requested his presence. Farming communities across Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia asked if he could visit. Not as a guest, but as a teacher. But Elijah had no interest in becoming a celebrity. His heart stayed with Sable Ridge in the quiet mornings and the rustle of wind through the beans. He agreed to a few visits, only where the land was hurting. Only where the people wanted to listen. He spoke in Kenya to smallholder farmers who reminded him of his own grandfather. He visited Peru and sat with indigenous growers who had never stopped listening to the soil. In India, he walked barefoot beside women who taught him how to read the wind by the way the millet bowed. He wasn't the expert in those places. He was the student again. And that, he believed, was how it should be. Back home in Sable Ridge, the world had changed while Elijah walked the earth. His farm had become more than a field. It was now a center. People called it the Ridge Institute, though Elijah never liked the name. To him, it was still just his land. His rows. His soil. But the small cabin he'd once lived in had grown into a community lodge built from reclaimed wood. Solar panels gleamed on the roof. The old barn had been converted into a teaching hall. Not a school, Elijah insisted on that. A place for remembering, he called it. Every week, people arrived by car, by bike, even by foot. Students, activists, researchers. Some with degrees, others with only questions. They all sat on upturned crates and listened while Elijah spoke beneath the sycamore tree that had stood since his youth. But he didn't just speak. He worked. Still rose before the sun. Still touched every leaf with intention. Still composted like it was prayer. He taught not by theory but by rhythm. By repetition. By quiet acts. Learning ain't memorizing, he told them. It's remembering what the earth already told you. His methods became policy in counties across Alabama. Small grants were created to support ancestral farming techniques. Local schools planted gardens based on his system. Shade-tolerant beans, nitrogen-fixing legumes, low-water strategies that made plots sing even during dry spells. Children who once wrinkled their noses at vegetables now pulled carrots from the ground with joy. Elders who had felt discarded became teachers again. And the soil? The soil responded. It grew thick with worms, rich with life, black as river mud, alive. Ava Cartwright, now a young woman with a fierce mind and steady hands, became his right hand. She managed the visitors, translated his methods into journals and diagrams, and slowly became the bridge between generations. You know, she told him one morning, you've got textbooks named after you now. Elijah laughed. Ain't no book can capture the way a tomato leans toward a sunbeam. Still he let her do the work. Because she carried the fire. Not the fame. Not the pride. The purpose. It was late autumn when Elijah received the letter. It came from the United Nations. A formal invitation, gold seal and all. They wanted to honor him with the Global Earth Steward Award, a title given to those who had changed not only policy but perception. A ceremony was planned in New York City. Speeches, media, a grand dinner. Elijah declined. Instead, he asked for the funds meant for the ceremony to be donated to a land trust for black farmers in the South. They need the land more than I need a stage, he told the official on the phone. Word of his refusal spread fast. Some called him noble, others foolish, but Elijah didn't care. His eyes were on something else. That same week, after months of labor, the southern ridge field, long thought barren, sprouted a line of sunflowers that reached higher than any in the region. It was as if the land had finally exhaled, as if it were speaking back in color and bloom. One evening, after the last rose had been watered and the volunteers had gone, Elijah sat alone on his porch, the sunset melting across the fields. He was older now. His knees stiffened more quickly. His breath sometimes caught when he laughed. But his spirit? Still rooted. Still growing. He looked out at the soil he had once dug with his bare hands when people laughed behind his back. At the land that had held him, fed him, carried him forward when the world had looked elsewhere. The laughter was gone now. In its place, gardens, children, harvest. In its place, respect. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes and whispered softly, "You remembered me." And the wind, warm and full, swept through the fields like an old friend returning home. The first seed bank to bear Elijah Walker's name was built not in Alabama, but in Malawi. It wasn't planned that way. A young agricultural student from the region had come through Sable Ridge a year prior, quiet, serious, with a notebook full of diagrams and 1,000 questions she asked with care. Her name was Thoko and she'd stayed an entire season. Elijah had shown her how to build compost from dry grass and fish bones, how to water by moonlight, how to pray by planting. When she returned to her village, she brought more than knowledge. She brought rhythm. Within a year, yields had doubled. The children no longer woke hungry. The village elders declared her the Walker daughter. And when the seed bank opened, built by hand, roofed with clay tiles and straw, there was a plaque beside the door. Read, "The soil remembers the gentle. In honor of Elijah Walker, keeper of the land, teacher of the forgotten." When the news reached Alabama, Elijah didn't say much. He only nodded once, the corner of his mouth twitching with something between pride and humility. "You hear that, little soil?" he said to Ava. "I ain't never been to Malawi, but my roots done reached it anyway." The seed bank was just the beginning. By the time winter settled in across Sable Ridge, 5 more communities, 2 in the Caribbean, 1 in Louisiana, another in rural Thailand, and 1 in a refugee settlement in northern Syria, had requested training directly from Elijah's methods. He refused to build a brand. There would be no official trademark, no corporation, no glossy certification. "Seeds don't belong to companies," he told a group of investors who flew in one morning with brochures and polished shoes. They belonged to the people. They belonged to the future. They left empty-handed. Instead, he built a circle, not an empire. A network of soil stewards trained by word, by presence, by labor. He called them the listeners. They came from all over, and when they left, they carried pieces of his method in pockets and memory, never in binders, always in their hands. Each listener took an oath under the sycamore tree, to serve the land before profit, to remember the wisdom of the elders, and to never, under any circumstance, poison the soil. They went on to train others. Slowly, steadily, the message spread. Not in headlines, but in harvests. Not in patents, but in abundance. Meanwhile, Elijah grew older. His steps became slower. He no longer walked the rows before dawn, but rode a small cart Ava insisted he use. Still, his eyes missed nothing. He noticed when the compost pile ran dry, when the okra leaned too far west, when the vines called out for more water even before the leaves drooped. One evening, while sitting under the tree that had become his classroom, he looked out over a group of visiting students from Texas. They were laughing, dirty, joyful, exhausted from a long day of real work. Elijah leaned over to Ava. "You see that?" he asked, voice raspy with time. She nodded. "They're listening." He smiled. "That's the harvest that matters." A few days later, the president of a local university came to visit. She brought with her a final offer. "We'd like to name a new agricultural science center after you," she said. "It'll be part of our sustainability department. A permanent institute." Elijah didn't respond right away. He stood up, slowly, and walked out to the edge of the field. The sun was beginning to fall low, casting long shadows through the rows of greens and squash. He knelt down, took a handful of soil, and breathed it in. Then he turned back to her. "Call it the School of Listening," he said. "If you can promise me that." She agreed. And so the center was born, the Elijah Walker School of Listening. It taught no fixed curriculum, no multiple-choice exams. Students spent their first month barefoot in the garden. Their final exam was to heal a patch of dying land and write a letter to a farmer no one had ever heard of. By then, Elijah was no longer attending meetings, no longer answering letters. But his legacy spoke louder than he ever had. In mulch, in seedlings, in the echo of young voices calling out across fields where laughter had returned. Sable Ridge no longer mocked the old man who once dug soil when others paved over it. They celebrated him. And across the world, a quiet movement grew. Not industrial, not viral, just human, just hungry, just sacred. The seeds had carried his name farther than his feet ever had. Elijah Walker passed in the early hours of a spring morning. It was gentle, like everything he had ever taught. No struggle, no noise, just a long exhale while the sky outside turned from gray to gold. Ava found him on the porch, wrapped in his old work coat, seated in his chair, hands folded across his chest like he was still listening to the whisper of the soil. There was no great ceremony, no parade. That wasn't his way. Instead, the people of Sable Ridge gathered in silence at the edge of his field. Farmers, students, teachers, old skeptics who had once laughed at him and now held tears in their eyes. They planted one seed each into the row he had marked with a stick the week before. No flowers, just seeds. Dozens of hands pressing into the soil, one after another, until the ground became a tapestry of promise. Ava spoke just once. "He didn't teach us to follow him," she said. "He taught us to follow the land." His burial was private. He was laid beneath the sycamore tree, the same tree where he had taught countless lessons, where hands were held and soil was sifted and the future had been reimagined. They placed nothing above him. No stone. Just a wooden sign carved by a child who had once been saved by a single harvest. "Here lies the one who listened first." But though his body rested, Elijah's voice did not. The School of Listening grew. Its branches reached into more nations, more languages. A classroom in Nairobi now bore his image on the wall, not a posed photograph but a candid sketch. Elijah with his boots in the mud, laughing as he held up a tomato as if it were a prize. In Brazil, a woman named Solange taught children how to compost by singing the same songs Elijah once hummed as he turned the piles. In Appalachia, a group of former coal miners now tilled ancestral gardens, saying, "If Elijah could heal the dirt, so can we." In Sweden, a group of climate activists began a seed-sharing program inspired by his teachings. They called it the Walker Wind, a name chosen because it carried what needed to be carried from one broken field to the next. Back in Sable Ridge, the land thrived. It was no longer just Elijah's farm, it belonged to the community. Every season, children still came to touch the earth, to smell the compost, to watch a squash flower bloom and know the miracle of time. His porch remained untouched. His chair stayed right where it was, facing the field. Sometimes Ava sat there. Other times strangers did. And sometimes no one. But even then it was not empty. Because the wind moved through it. And the wind remembered. Years passed. Generations turned. The world grew louder, faster. But here and there, across valleys and borders, in humble plots and learning gardens, a quiet practice continued. Hands pressing into soil. Heads bowed in patience. Seeds offered not just for survival but for reverence. And each time someone whispered his name. Not like a slogan. Not like a brand. But like a prayer. Elijah Walker. The man who dug soil when they told him not to. The man who listened when the world stopped hearing. The man who taught the earth to speak again. And the earth in return remembered his name. Forever. The end. Here are 7 in-depth moral lessons drawn from this story. 1. Wisdom is not always loud, but it is always lasting. Elijah Walker was not the kind of man who shouted to be heard. In a world obsessed with speed, noise, and visibility, his strength came from silence. From listening. From walking the land when no one watched. He didn't rush to prove anyone wrong or to earn applause. Instead, he let the work speak. The soil, the sprouts, the harvest, these were his arguments. His legacy was built not through debate, but through demonstration. This teaches us that true wisdom is not always found in lectures or headlines. It's found in quiet repetition. In the patience to do something well even when no one notices. In trusting that truth will rise, slowly like seedlings, but inevitably. The lesson? Do not chase validation. Chase truth. In the end, what is real will endure. 2. The soil remembers. So should we. Throughout the story, Elijah teaches that the land is not a tool, it is a living memory. His methods weren't inventions. They were rememberings, ancestral practices passed down by hands that came before him, refined not in labs, but in fields scarred by labor and survival. In honoring these techniques, Elijah honors those who were erased from textbooks but who built the foundation of sustainable living. His legacy urges us to recover what colonization, commercialization, and modern arrogance have buried. The sacred bond between people and the earth. The lesson? Progress is not always forward. Sometimes it's backward, into memory, into roots, into reverence. 3. Legacy is measured in what you plant, not what you own. Elijah never sought titles. He refused awards, declined money, ignored corporate offers. Yet his teachings traveled the globe. Communities named seed banks after him. Students carried his lessons into faraway soil. His words became movement, not merchandise. We live in a time when success is often measured in possessions, profiles, and portfolios. But Elijah's life reminds us that what you plant, physically, spiritually, and generationally, matters more than what you possess. Real legacy is not held in your hands. It grows beyond them. 4. The most radical act is to remember your grandmother's hands. Elijah often spoke of his grandfather, of the traditions that survived not in books but in rituals, in songs hummed while planting, in soil sifted between brown fingers. These memories carried forward became rebellion. In a world that dismissed him as backward, his remembering became revolution. This moral reminds us, there is power in reclaiming what our ancestors knew. In a culture that devalues the old, the oral, the handmade, remembering becomes an act of justice. Whether it's a recipe, a story, or a method of growing food, these passed-down practices carry dignity and survival. 5. Change the world by healing what's under your feet. Elijah didn't fly to Geneva to start a movement. He didn't even leave Alabama at first. He simply dug, healed, planted, listened. The global impact came after the local restoration. This is the reverse of how we're often taught to lead. Build big, scale fast, go global. But Elijah's life says otherwise. Start where you stand. Heal one patch of earth. Feed one hungry family. Fix one broken system in your neighborhood. If it is real, it will ripple outward. If it is just, it will grow. Global change often begins with someone healing a single acre, a single child, a single truth. 6. The earth is alive, and it is listening. This may be the most spiritual of all Elijah's lessons. He treats the earth not as property but as kin. He listens to the wind, reads the soil, talks to the vines. And in return the earth speaks. In blooms. In resilience. In abundance. This moral is deeply countercultural in a world that treats the earth as dead matter, something to exploit. But Elijah's life insists otherwise. When you listen, the land speaks. When you care, it responds. When you honor it, it remembers you. This is not poetry. This is truth. 7. You don't have to be known to be remembered. Elijah's fame came late, and even then he avoided it. He didn't seek credit, yet he became unforgettable. His lessons spread across continents, and generations spoke his name not because he demanded it, but because he lived it. In a world desperate to be seen, this lesson is revolutionary. It's not your face on a screen that makes you matter, it's your fingerprints on the lives you touch. Do good work, care for people, love the land. Let your name be carried not by microphones but by memory. Final reflection. Elijah Walker's life teaches us that greatness is quiet, that power grows from patience, that in the end, when the noise dies down, the earth will remember only those who listened, who nurtured, who served. Let us be such people. Let us plant like Elijah did, not just seeds but hope. And trust that when we are gone, the soil will still remember our names. Thank you for watching and listening to this story. We hope Elijah Walker's quiet strength and timeless wisdom left something meaningful in your heart today. In a world that often forgets the past, may his journey remind us that sometimes, the answers we need are buried right beneath our feet. If this story moved you, inspired you, or simply gave you something to think about, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you enjoyed this journey, there's more where that came from. Check out the other stories on this channel, each one crafted to inspire, uplift, and remind us of the quiet power we all carry. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and never forget, the earth remembers.